So even though I said I'm not going to summarize, I guess a little bit of summary is necessitated just to dive back into the material. We had talked about how everything in our liturgical tradition is ultimately about one thing. And this is true of every Catholic liturgical rite, East, Western, whatever you want to look at in the overall Catholic tradition. And that one goal is to reveal the kingdom. And behind all the sacraments, in a certain sense, we can say that there is the one sacrament in the kingdom, of the kingdom. And the way that sacraments work is a mysterious way. That's even the Greek term for sacrament, mysterion, which means a secret, something hidden, something veiled, which is unlocked for those who have been initiated through the proper interpretive sort of key that we have access to in our Christian initiation. And that key, once again, is Christ, the experience of Christ, the mystery of Christ, the cross of Christ. And then we can see in all the various veiled movements and objects of our liturgical tradition, Christ revealed in this mysterious way. And of course, our vestments are like that too. Vestments at once serve to veil those wearing the vestments, but if you have the eyes to see and the ears to hear, you can perceive through a more subtle kind of vision, a more subtle kind of perception, how in this veiling they become more than what they are. They reveal themselves to be more than mere men. As the Latins say, priests serve in persona Christi, in the person of Christ, and they reveal, we might say, the icon of Christ, the image of Christ. And that image that they reveal in their vestments, in their liturgical ministry, is an image of the restored state of Adam in all his glory before the fall, which is what priesthood is supposed to represent, which is what kingship is supposed to represent, and which is what baptism is supposed to represent. And so we talked about the Stacharion, which was the base of all the vestments, the base layer of all the vestments. It's what all the servers, all subdeacons, deacons, priests, bishops wear. We talked about the Phalonion, which is equivalent to the priestly chasuble of the West, which we're seeing here. The icon of Saint Basil wearing the Polystavrion, the many-crossed Phalonion in the ancient form, which was fuller in the front, and then, of course, a depiction of a conical chasuble of the West. And we can see how they're obviously interrelated garments. And today we'll keep talking about the rest of the priestly vestments. And I said before that basically when we think of a priest, we think of two bits of vestments. The Phalonion that we just talked about, and also his priestly stole. That's also kind of what basically his key vestment. And in the Greek tradition, in the Byzantine tradition, his stole is called an epitrachelion, which just means the thing that he wears around the neck. That's basically what he means. Like trachea, trachelion, epi means on. So the thing that he wears around the neck. And of course, we know what stoles look like in the West. So what's the relationship between the priestly stole of the West, the epitrachelion of the Byzantine East, and also its connection to the deacon's stole, and also the stole that the subdeacon wears too. And, when we think about what a Western stole looks like, it's not really like this. It's basically a ribbon or a scarf that's worn around the neck, right? So it's a long rectangle that's draped around the neck. But when we look at the Byzantine epitrachelion, we see it almost as like a solid piece. And sometimes it has a line down the middle to make it seem like it's two pieces. But other times we see like one solid piece, like these, like the yellow one. Or like that's the black one, yeah. Right? And we might say that this was a development upon the original form. Like it became more convenient to sort of, for tailors to sort of cut out the garment that way and just make a hole on the top, But originally, of course, it was like the Western stole. It was a ribbon or a scarf that was draped around the neck. By the 17th century, it did take on this sort of block form. But the fact that mostly it retains the sort of facade of being two pieces in the front does betray its origin in the same garment as the priestly stole, or as even the deacon's orarion. So the difference between the deacon's orarion was that it was worn on the shoulder, and the priest wore it around his neck, right? And both the deacons stole, like Conrad sort of asked this question before, what the origin of the deacon's stole was, and you had said something about the Senate. So the origin of both the deacon's stole, the orarion, and the priestly stole, the epitrachilion, is in basically the court ceremonial of the Roman world in late antiquity. And the court ceremonial of late antiquity was itself a development of earlier Roman practices. And so basically there was a category of garment called sudarium, which was basically a ceremonial napkin of some sort, or a ceremonial scarf of some sort, that was worn in different ways and different manners. Some of them were small, which we'll look at in a second here, and some of them were more elaborate. The most elaborate form, so keep that in the back of your mind, and we'll return to it when we get to something that I'll show y'all. But basically, there was a whole series of different kinds of ceremonial scarves that were used in Roman court attire that was basically adopted into the church, both East and West, as the church became sort of legalized by the empire and even patronized by the empire, But it quickly took on spiritual meaning too, right? As I said last time, the fathers weren't really interested in the secular origins of any of the priestly garments. They were just quick to apply spiritual meaning to it, right? And so in the vesting prayer, we kind of see this, right? The vesting prayer for the epitrachilion is, "Blessed is God, who poureth out his grace upon his priests, like unto the oil of myrrh upon his head, which runneth down upon the beard of Aaron, which runneth down to the fringes of his raiment." So it's immediately associated with the appearance and the garments of the priestly vestments of the Old Testament too, right? It intuits a kind of aesthetic sort of relationship between how the stole drapes and Aaron's long beard, or like the oil of ordination that covers his head, like pouring out from him, in this abundance, right? And so this stole kind of jutting out from his upper body kind of is like the overflowing grace of his priesthood, coming down, right? So it's connected to these Old Testament archetypes, despite its secular Roman origin. And then, of course, the idea of fringes, immediately one might think, if one is knowledgeable about Judaism, how men wear the fringes on their, I think they're called tzitzit, the fringes. They wear like special garments that have like fringes on it. And of course, like they add fringes to this, and we might think of the miracles of Christ, where people reach out to touch the fringes of his garment. So even though it has a secular Roman origin, it's quickly adapted to sort of the network of symbolism of biblical and scriptural imagery. And here's some historical ones. And the historical ones, you can actually see the original origin revealed. So if we go from the far one, the yellow one, that's basically how the modern ones look, except that it's more of the block form rather than the split form in the middle. But then when you get to the ones on this side, you can see that it's just an oraria, right? So because the top looks different, right? So rather than it being one solid piece that's tailored to resemble two pieces in the front, it actually is a loose orarion, or a loose stole, similar to a Western stole or the deacon's stole, that's just draped around the neck, right? So that's the original form of the orarion that was eventually adapted to the ones that we know today, which we kind of see very fancy historical ones on the other side there. And we see the original form of the orarion, what it would have looked like when it was worn. So it would be kind of pressed against the neck rather than laying flat. So that's kind of the benefit of the modern one. Imagine a hot day, in the summer serving, you have a bunch of stuff on your neck, your phalonion, the tie back, So yeah, the modern one just became more convenient, although the ancient one, you see its origin with its relationship with the Western stole and the deacon's orarion, and it kind of looks cool in a certain way. And actually, if you remember the one that I showed you before, the one over here has restored the original form of the orarion. That's why it's like laying on the neck like that.
Black and white one.
The one that has it's I think it's a deep burgundy, but it does look black there. Yeah. Yeah. So it looks cool, but it might get kind of hot, and it might get kind of dirty too from your natural oils from sweat and things like that. But regardless, so I guess that's why they changed it. That's why they adapted it. And I have these images just to show you the relationship between. So that's not a modern orarium. That's not modern Orthodox vestments. That's a reconstruction of ancient Byzantine vestments in the middle. And I'm showing you a traditional Roman Catholic priest to show you the relationship between those two garments, those two sets of garments, right? So the reconstructed. So just to make it clear, right? The old form, the modern form we see here, and then this reconstructed ancient guy in the middle. So obviously it looks similar, but it's not the same, mostly because of the style of girdle called the zoni, which I'll talk about in a second here. The style of the rectangle, which is like a loose piece of cloth here rather than a stiffened piece, which I'll talk about in a second too. And as I said, the orarion is the ancient form, which rests on the neck rather than being flat and tailored in that way, right? And then we see the Western priest with his cross stole. But it's you can see that they're obviously related. Our Byzantine tradition, or rather our East Roman tradition, is directly connected to our West Roman tradition. Now, as I said, in this reconstructed Byzantine set of vestments that is not worn today, it's a historical reconstruction. We see that over his stole, he has like a rope cincture, just like the Western priest has, right? So just like a rope girdle that's used to fasten everything together. But of course, that is not what's used today. So what we use today is a garment called the zoni, which is what we see in the purple down here, right? This is what we see today as the zoni. The one above is a variant, fancy one, which you don't really see that often. So like in historical examples, in really fancy monastic vestments, you see a zoni with these fancy metallic buckles, but basically you never see them. Like at churches, you would never see that. You would always see this guy, this rectangular cloth, and it has ribbons in the back to tie. And of course, it's a development on a simple girdle. So originally it was probably just a rope, a cincture, with the same origin as the Western cincture. And then just to make it fancy, they used a piece of brocade as the piece of rope, sometimes with a fancy buckle, but then, like I said, you don't really see that too often, and this is what you see today, and that's called the zoni. And just real quick, the prayer of the zoni is a short one. Blessed is God who girds me with strength and makes my way blameless. So there's a connection between the girdle and blamelessness. And of course, we might think of how the Western cincture is connected to chastity, to guard yourself, to gird yourself, Now, we also see an interesting garment here, which y'all asked about last week. And it's this piece of, it's a diamond-shaped cloth or a square-shaped cloth. And here, it just looks like a loose kind of napkin-looking thing here. But of course, when we looked at the earlier examples, it's not like a loose napkin, but it's like a stiff board right here, right? Or here, yeah, and that's what we see today. Like I said, that other image is a historical reconstruction, right? So it's telling us. So if you look at iconography, though, it is a loose piece of fabric.
That is?
Yeah, right. See, so here we actually see what it looks like today. It's stiff, and that might be because it has all those jewels on it to make it so. But this is the same thing here.
I would have not have picked that out as the same thing.
Yeah, but we see that it is here, right? Yeah, it's that garment, right? I'll just show you one more thing in connection to that real quick. Maybe not. Maybe I don't have that. Never mind. Yeah, so that garment, that vestment is called the epigonation. In Slavonic or in Russian, it's called the palitsa. And it's connected to another vestment that's only worn in the Russian tradition called the nabedrenik. So it's not worn in the Greek tradition, it's only worn in the Russian tradition. And so the difference between the epigonation is that the square is on its side, making it diamond shaped, and the fastener is on the corner, making a diamond shape. And then the Nebedrenik is on the side, so it's square, right? So you only see this guy in Russia or in the Russian tradition, and every Byzantine tradition has this guy, has the epigonation. So we see here how it would be worn if you have both, the priest with his epigonation over here and the Nebedrenik over here. So what are these garments? So the different traditions basically treat them differently. So I'll just speak broadly and say that basically they belong to the category of non-essential vestments. So some priests in the broader Byzantine tradition, like especially in the Greek Orthodox world, they wouldn't have either of these. So a Greek priest would never get the square one. He would never get the Nebedrenik. But he might not start out with the epigonation either. It's because they're considered clergy awards. Yeah. So like you get them for years of service or to designate a certain function. So in the Greek tradition that I'm familiar with, when a priest is first ordained, especially in the sort of Greek theological educational system where there's different levels of theological education, and also like their priests are basically like civil servants, so they're like mailmen, like in the minds of people, right? So like when a priest is first ordained, especially if they have the lowest level of theological training, they don't get the epigonation, which means that they cannot hear confessions, right? So they're not confessors. They're just liturgizers. In other words, they're mass factories.
Sacerdotal simplex.
Yeah.
So the West has a very similar concept, right? And the idea is because he doesn't have the theological and spiritual training on the higher level, he cannot be counted on to give people spiritual counsel, and so he might not even preach, especially in the olden days, Back in the day, basically bishops were the only ones that preached, or their designated representatives who were probably like archimandrites, and so there would be like one archimandrite in like a diocese that would travel from church to church giving retreats and sermons, and you read these historical accounts of like, oh, there's going to be a sermon this Sunday, and so there's a massive crowd that gathers in the town square to listen to the sermon. Listen, they didn't have TV back then,
Well, that also reminds me of like stories you hear about the religious founding of America. The Protestants behaved that way too.
Yeah. Or like you think about, St. John Chrysostom was known to be the great preacher, right? But probably he wasn't giving those sermons in mass. Probably it was like, oh, we gotta all gather for the bishop's sermon today on Sunday afternoon, in the cathedral square, and he'll get up on some kind of podium and then everybody gathers and listen to his 3-hour-long sermon. Because like I said, they didn't have TV or, so they had whatever entertainment they could get, and that's why these preachers, St. John Chrysostom is basically like Jonathan Edwards preaching these fire and brimstone sermons. So it's like, yeah, it interests people to hear this stuff, But anyways, so the epigonation in the Greek tradition indicates that they're a confessor, and there's similar things going on with the Nebedrenik. They indicate some kind of years of service, some kind of award, or some kind of status that is not default in the priestly state. Now, in this country, it's often the case, even in the Greek tradition, that you do get the epigonation because it's thought that, like, well, if you're going to be the only priest in this parish and you can't hear confessions, that's not going to be good. You need to provide all the pastoral services that you can in your ministry. And also in the Russian tradition, generally speaking, all priests are confessors, because, like I said, you could be sent to far-flung Siberia, to be the parish priest in this village, and they need to go to confession, But like if you live in a metropolitan Greek city, there's probably like at least 2 or 3 dozen parishes, but like those are secular institutions, and you go there for church on Sundays. But when you want to do real spiritual stuff, you go to the monastery, right? That's about 30 minutes outside of town, and that's where you get confession. That's where you get spiritual counsel. That's where you feel the spiritual vibes, But then, like in the parish, that's kind of like the post office. That's kind of like any other, it's, I'm exaggerating it a little bit, but but yeah, when you want, in other words, spiritual stuff, confession is available somewhere, not necessarily in your parish, But if you live in an Orthodox country, there's lots of institutions, available, right? And so the vesting prayer of the epigonatian, on the thigh, epigonatian. Sometimes you hear people say epigonation, but epigonatian. That's the
Texan term.
yeah. So once again, the diamond one is the epigonatian, also known as the palitza in Russian. And that prayer is, gird thy sword upon thy thigh, O mighty one, in thy comeliness and thy beauty, and bend thy bow and proceed prosperously, and be king because of truth and meekness and righteousness, and thy right hand shall guide thee wondrously, always now and ever, unto ages of ages. Amen. And actually, there's no separate prayer for the Nebedronic, so they both have that prayer. And so you have the imagery you have this regal imagery, this imagery of beauty, this is imagery of the thigh, because it's on the thigh, but specifically the sword that rests on the thigh, right? So the immediate idea is it's kind of a spiritual sword. It's symbolic of a spiritual sword. And that makes sense, especially in its connection to confession, right? Because in confession, the idea is that the priest is a spiritual surgeon that has to cut out rotting flesh from us, spiritually speaking, to separate those things that are corrupt in our hearts. So you might think it's connected to that, and that's perfectly valid. Also in the sense that in confession we defeat the demons that assail us. So another application of a sword. So like I said, in iconography we see these depictions, right? And it's like the reconstructed image that we just looked at. They appear loose because they're folded over, right? The stiffened boards wouldn't fold over. And over here, it's kind of folded on the thigh itself, which wouldn't happen if it's stiff. So we have this, we see in the iconography that the origin of the epigonatian was, once again, in these categories of cloths, these ceremonial cloths called the sudarium. And like I said, the stole was one example. The epigonatian / Nebedronic / palitza is another example. And I want to point out that here in this, I think that's Pope Hilarious. He is depicted with two, one on this side and one on that side, which fits, the use of two, the epigonatian and the Nebedronic. So it seems that some hierarchs wore two, some bishops wore two. So it probably started out with the bishops also, and then it trickled down to the priests. Like I said last time, it starts out fancy, and then everybody wants the fancy stuff, right? And so probably it started out as a episcopal garment that went down to the priest later on, which is why it has to be granted, right? That's why theoretically a pectoral cross has to be granted, because it's originally a bishop's garment too. So originally it was this kind of loose cloth napkin thing, a type of sudarium. Specifically, it had the term in Greek, the enchirion. And we see depictions of these in both East and West by the 10th century. According to Balsamum, in the 12th century, only bishops wore it. And like I said, it trickled down to the priest. And like I said, it wasn't stiff until the 12th century, probably. So we might say, so is this a uniquely Byzantine garment, or is there any corollary in the Western vestments, right? And at first instance, you might think, this seems uniquely Byzantine, because I can't think of anything that Western priests wear. Well, you have to actually go back to what I said, that it originates in a cloth, a ceremonial cloth, right? And there's two instances where a Roman priest, at least in the traditional garments, would wear a ceremonial cloth. One is the maniple that he wears on his wrist, which looks like this, right? It looks like a little stole, basically, that he wears on his wrist, and that was also a kind of sudarium. It originates from the same practice of wearing the plural is sudaria. But also, there's another garment that is no longer worn. It was possibly never worn by priests. It was worn by bishops at one point, but then it kind of fell out of practice, except in the context of papal vestments. And this is a pattern we see often, that the papal vestments often preserve ancient forms of the garments, right? Because the papal office is conservative by its nature, right? Just like monarchies are conservative by nature. So the Pope used to, like I said, bishops used to do this, but the Pope would wear a garment called the subcinctorium, which means under the cincture, under the girdle, which looked like a maniple. So this is actually a depiction of a subsectorium, not a maniple. So it was worn. So that rope is the girdle of the waist, the cincture of the waist, and it was worn like that. And so obviously it seems pretty similar, like a rectangular piece of fabric hanging from the belt. It seems to have been worn in the West as well, because like once again, this is Pope Hilarious, so he has two of them, So he probably had one on this side, one on that side, and in the West it eventually fell out of usage, and in the East it continued to be worn eventually by priests as well. And we see in the Western usage specifically a hint at its deeper meaning. I said that it probably originates from a ceremonial cloth, a sudarium. There's one other possibility of what it might be, or it's probably both and it's sort of merged in its form, right? And this other thing is that, okay, so we know that one of the duties of bishops was to care for the widows and orphans of the city, right? And so they had a like a coffer, right? And they had clergy under them that were basically in charge of that coffer to distribute the funds to the widows and the orphans, right? So one possibility is that there was a special coin purse that the Pope gave to important priests that they would wear on their cincture, and they would distribute these alms to those who needed it. Now, that's actually also interesting, especially in light of what I said regarding confession, right? So if it was originally some sort of coin purse that a bishop granted priests to distribute to those in need, there's an immediate spiritual connection, right? So it's not necessarily material blessings that they give out now, but as confessor, now they can distribute the spiritual alms in the case of the sacrament of confession, right? So distributing this grace freely, just as they distributed the money freely before, right? So that's another possible connection, and it's interesting, at least to me, to think about that possibility. Probably, I like to think that both existed and they kind of merged into one thing, and here's another depiction. This priest. So you notice in a lot of ancient Byzantine icons that they would hike up the phalonion on one arm. So we kind of saw that. I'm not going to go all the way back, but we saw that earlier. But so we see this priest censing in a censer, with the censer holding the gospel, and then here we see the enchirion, which eventually developed into the epigonation that we're talking about, right? And once again, it's this kind of loose piece of fabric that's kind of folded over, right? So we see it in ancient depictions. It looks like we'll finish, because this is one of the last things we'll talk about today. So earlier we talked about how the phalonion, the priestly chasuble, was worn by priests and bishops and all the ancient icons, just like the ones that we just looked at here, right? At least those three in the middle are bishops, right? However, if you go to a hierarchical liturgy today, very rarely, you do see it sometimes, but very rarely would you see a bishop wearing a phalonion. There is an effort today, once again, as a kind of reconstruction to bishops can wear the phalonion, so we'll wear it. It's kind of neat and cool to see. But basically, in the normal form of the hierarchical service, the pontifical service, bishops wear a different garment in lieu of the phalonion, and that's the sakos. And it was adopted in the place of the phalonion around the 12th or 13th century. First by the Patriarch of Constantinople, and then other very important bishops of important sees began adopting it in imitation, because once again, everybody wants the fancy stuff, slowly but surely, right? And then eventually it became the normal garment of the bishops. And you might think that it kind of looks like the Stacharion, because it also derives from the ancient Roman tunic, right? So a lot of things come from the ancient tunic, right? The ancient tunic became the alb / Stacharion / dalmatic / sakos later on. And basically a sakos was just a really fancy Stacharion. It was the kind of Stacharion called, I believe it was called the divestesion, that was worn by basically the highest members of the imperial court, and also the emperors and the empresses themselves in their official regal regalia, imperial regalia. So it was kind of a royal tunic, an imperial tunic. And the vesting prayer for this garment is, "Thy high priests," actually it's the same prayer as the Phalonian, which kind of points to the fact that it's a later vestment, right? They didn't have time to develop a different prayer for it, right? So it's the same prayer. Sometimes, like I just read here, they'll add the word high priest. "Thy high priests, O Lord, shall clothe themselves," whereas the Phalonian prayer just says, "Thy priests, O Lord, shall clothe themselves," to differentiate the bishops from the priests. Yeah, I mean, as we can see, the historical examples are very rich and beautiful. Specifically, blue was associated with the Patriarch of Constantinople for various reasons, which I'll touch on in a second. But yeah, the rich, when we look at some of these, there's very rich iconographic embroidery as well. And this rich iconographic embroidery featuring the life of Christ served to unambiguously identify the bishop, the one wearing it, with Christ himself, right? We might say if Christians spiritually put on Christ in baptism, bishops did so literally in the icons that they put on their own bodies. The bishop became a living icon of Christ. Literally, this icon, this image engulfed him in the life of Christ on his vestments, through his vestments, which also mirrored. So all this Christological embroidery, it mirrored the predominant interpretation of the liturgy in the patristic period, which at that time was understood, and today I would say that this is the patristic understanding. It mirrors the life, it reflects the life of Christ, right? So in the ancient patristic commentaries on the liturgy, they would say like, oh, when we do the little entrance, that's when Christ comes to preach the gospel, and that's why we carry the gospel. At the great entrance, that's Christ on the Via Dolorosa, Christ going to Golgotha, stuff like that. When the priest moves his hand like this, it symbolizes this from the life of Christ, So modern liturgical commentators have sort of disliked that, and they've tried to like deconstruct and say, oh, that's a later medieval accretion. Okay, but it was a universal one. It was one done by all the fathers. It was done in both East and West. Thomas Aquinas does the same thing. Other commentators do the same thing. They'll say like in the Mass, when the server carries this candle, that's John the Baptist bringing the, it's the exact same kind of thing, right? So the early church, the ancient church, both East and West, had the same way of interpreting the Mass, the liturgy, and that was Christological, as a Christological allegory. And then you combine that with the fact that the bishops are wearing Christ on their vestments. It just serves to highlight that they're interpreting the liturgy in this Christological way, which goes all the way back to the beginning of my presentation when I talked about how it's Christ that opens the veil to understand the meaning of the mysteries, right? So everything must be interpreted in the light of Christ, right?
How common was this? I mean, that's an insane amount.
Well, number one, only for bishops, right? And originally only for the most important bishops, right? So the short answer is not that common. Yeah, not that common. Yeah. Now, like in later examples, they're not as fancy, right?
Yeah.
They look more like the Stacarian, just like a little bit more fancy and a little bit more voluminous, right? So the life of Christ was reenacted in the liturgy, and the life of Christ was born on the bodies of the bishops themselves, who stood in persona Christi, as we already said. And it's interesting when we see Byzantine icons of Christ as the great high priest, he's vested exactly like a Byzantine bishop, right, wearing a sakos, and that sakos looks very similar to the one that we just looked at here, the blue one, with the gammas, which are meant to form crosses. So he's wearing that, and you can't really tell in the image, but it is a blue, not a black. And these pious lay people here who commissioned the church or the icon, they're like little people, because in light of Christ, it's showing how we're nothing before Christ, kind of thing.
Is this kind of icon that we presented to Bishop Daniel.
Okay, yeah, and there is a kind of ambiguity in the sense that is it pontifical vestments, like bishop's vestments, hierarchical vestments, or is it regal regalia? Is it imperial? Because sometimes this icon is called Christ the Great High Priest, and sometimes it's Christ the King. Sometimes it'll say Basileus, sometimes like King of Kings, Basileus, whatever the genitive of that is. And some
Does it say that
Yeah, this one, and this one says King of Kings. This one says Basilate.
That doesn't say King of Kings.
No, it sure doesn't.
Yeah, but whatever, Basilea is Basilea,
Right.
whatever the genitive of Basilea, yeah. But it's the same icon, and like I said, it was an adoption of the secular, like all these vestments were, right? This one is the latest one, but it was an adoption of the secular court regalia in a new ecclesiastical context, elevating it and thereby spiritualizing it, right? And it does make sense in a certain sense, right? Because we want to bring the best into the liturgy, right? The apex of all beauty and the best stuff, and also the idea of priesthood itself is linked symbolically to priesthood, because what does a priest do? A priest stands between God and man, summarizing mankind before God and God to mankind, representing God to mankind, mankind to God. What does a king do? A king summarizes all the people to God, in a certain sense, the power and order of God to his subjects, right? So there is a regal and there's a connection between the regal and the priestly, and that's why Christ is both the King of Kings and he's also the great high priest, right? And that's why priests wear crowns. Even the high priest of Jerusalem, right? He wore his golden turban that had the name of Yahweh written on it, right? And there's even Old Testament passages that are very ambiguous. Is Solomon sitting there's a passage where it talks about how Solomon sat on his throne in the temple and everyone bowed down, and that's very ambiguous. What is it describing? Is Solomon sitting on the Ark of the Covenant and people are bowing down? Actually, there's some scholars that say that is what he was doing, and some scholars would say that that plaque on the high priest's turban, so in modern translation it says holy unto Yahweh, but there's a theory that originally it just said Yahweh, meaning that when the priest put on the priestly garments, he represented the Lord himself. And there may be even a ritual where he was ritually enthroned on the ark, right? Very weird, cool stuff, fascinating to think about.
The Greek, there's two different forms of it because it gets abbreviated, but it's basileus ton, basilean ton.
Oh, yeah.
But they drop the tone, so it's just basileus, basilean.
Sure, that would be, yeah. Yeah, but here's another one where it's a heavenly liturgy, right? Just like I said, the ancient commentators saw how everything was reflected, right? And so it's also not funny, but interesting because it shows layers of development, right? Layers of interpretive development. Because Jesus is here, but Jesus is here. Yeah. And also Jesus is here. And these are angels, but then these are angels, So Christ is dressed as the great high priest, the bishop, Byzantine bishop, receiving the great entrance of the liturgy, basically. That's what's being depicted.
Yeah, there's that one in the back. Does that have like a?
Oh yeah, and some of the angels are deacons, and some of them are priests.
Yeah.
Right? Because these are in Sticharia and Oraria, and this guy is in a Phalonian and Epitrelian.
Yeah.
And he's holding the chalice. So it's interesting. Yeah.
What? Maybe we talked about this last time, but the white soul with the crosses. That's a separate.
So we'll talk about that next. Actually, Actually, we might not finish. We'll see what happens. I just realized we have to talk about two more things.
That's fine. I was like, you said we were about to finish.
Yeah. No. There's two more things we have to talk about. And there actually is an interesting parallel in the West. You might think, Western bishops do wear the chasuble, but if you know a lot about the history of Western vestments and liturgy, you know that the traditional proper way that a bishop would vest is the one of the main differences between how a bishop puts on his chasuble and how a priest does is before he puts on his chasuble, he theoretically puts on a dalmatic, and it's usually a very fancy one, right? Which would look like a sakos, right? Because they're the same garment basically, right? And so there does seem to be so one can conjecture this way, right? This fancy imperial dalmatic or Sticharion, at some point it was gifted to the bishop to wear, the Archbishop of Constantinople, and maybe the Pope too. And the practice of wearing this garment spread from there. But in the West, they retained the Phalonian / chasuble as well, and so they just put it on top. Something like that, right? The usual Western explanation is that the reason a bishop wears it is because he has all the orders of the priesthood. He has the deaconate, he has the priesthood, and his episcopate, right? That might be a simpler reason, although one might question why a priest wouldn't wear a dalmatic too, because he also has diaconate, right? And like they regularly served as deacons and subdeacons in the high mass, because they didn't really have deacons and subdeacons, in the Middle Ages. Very few. So that might be a Western parallel, or it might be completely unrelated, but it's an interesting parallel if so. So here's some beautiful, interesting modern examples.
Is this what when we saw?
So everything that I showed you before, that was Sticharia. This is a Sakos.
What part of the bishop's vestments had the tilma on it when we saw Nicholas's ordination?
Had the what on it? Oh, he didn't wear vestments with the tilma. That was like
He put it on afterwards.
that was a scarf he had. That wasn't a vestment.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, he was wearing a poncho or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that wasn't a vestment. That was literally like a knit poncho.
Okay.
Like a wool poncho. Yeah, that was it. Yeah. But yeah, these are, believe it or not, modern vestments. You can buy these. They're very expensive, probably like $20,000 or something like that. But they do preserve that ancient, beautiful aesthetic, especially the Christological embroidery. These are different ones actually. They're not the same ones. I'm pretty sure they're different ones. But beautiful stuff. And as you can see, it's the same basic garment as the Stacharion / Dalmatic / alb / whatever. Just like a really fancy version, So the next garment we're going to talk about is the one that Janie mentioned. The one in the icons had red crosses. They have different kinds of crosses, but it's called the omophorion. And this garment, along with the sakos, is the quintessential sort of vestment of the episcopate, right? If you want to say that for the priesthood, it's the phalonion and the epitrachilion, or the chasuble and the stole. They also wear the epitrachilion underneath. Underneath that, so you can see here, they still have the epitrachilion, right? So this layer, the Sticharion, and this layer, and they also have the girdle, and they have the epigonation. That's all the same between priesthood and the bishops, and then they wear the sakos instead of the phalonion, and then, as I said, they put on the omophorion. And there's a couple of different forms of the omophorion. These two are basically the same, just kind of slightly stylized differently. And then this one is one called the small omophorion. And the reason why this one exists is because the great omophorion, which is what these are, became too troublesome to put on, because they're actually very complex. Like if you ever watch a hierarchical liturgy, like two subdeacons have to vest him in it, and there's like a special way to fold it in the back, because it's not sitting in a natural way. So there's like folds within folds, and there's little buttons and loops that hold it in place. So it's actually a very complex thing, and it's like
Is it one long piece?
it is one long rectangle. Yeah. So this is one long piece, right? So this one that Patriarch Sviatoslav is wearing is actually in appearance relatively the same as this, but it's basically it's the easy version of it, where it's like
That's right, that's what I was
it's like a clip-on tie basically. It's just cut out in the shape of it, but there's no way to unfold it.
Right.
So a lot of Greek Catholic bishops have adopted the rapid deployment omophorion, although theoretically the traditional form is this. But you can see that, yeah. And another thing that the Greek Catholics have adopted, us Greek Catholics have adopted, is that they've adopted this interesting ranking system on the omophorion. So when you look at Orthodox ones, they usually just have 2 or 3, and there's no meaning behind it. But in the Greek Catholic world, they've adopted like military stripes. So when there's 5, that means you're a patriarch. Yeah. And if there's 3, that just means you're a regular bishop. I don't know if 2 and 4 mean anything, or 1, or if even 1 exists. So I don't know. I would guess so, right? I would get, like, if you ask me, is that something? But yeah,
Seems reasonable.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, so yeah.
In the icon of St. Nicholas, where I think it was the Theotokos appeared to St. Constantine, on behalf of St. Nicholas, it's the omophorion? Is that what she presents? I think it's sometimes in the corner of icons of St. Nicholas.
Yeah. So sometimes we use so omophorion can mean like any kind of mantle too.
Okay.
So like we talk about being under Our Lady's omophorion, right? So it's her protecting veil, right? So I don't know in that vision.
I think she's showing a part of St. Nicholas's vestment.
Okay. I don't remember all the details, so like, yeah. Because we talk about the Theotokos and her veil all the time, so I can't remember if it was her protection she was offering or showing his episcopal.
There might be different variants
Yeah,
of this.
yeah.
The one I remember is I think she shows some of his bishop's regalia to Constantine
Okay.
and says you should let him out of prison.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
I checked in the 5 bars, it's usually patriarch, but if it's a major metropolitan, it's the head
Yeah.
of Syria's church.
Patriarch or equivalent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not typical, but there's been some cases of auxiliary bishops wearing 2 bars.
Makes sense, yeah. Yeah. But the default in the Orthodox world is just 2. Sometimes you see 3, and sometimes you see 1, and sometimes you see none.
Does it mean anything, or is it?
No, that's what I'm saying. In the Orthodox world, that has no meaning.
Okay.
It's only in the Greek Catholic world that it became this kind of rank thing. That said, the Orthodox world has other kinds of weird ranking stuff. Like if you have a silver cross or a gold cross with a little jewel dangling or 3 dangling jewels, So there's all sorts of the color of your hat, all kinds of things. So, so the vesting prayer of the Omophorion is, "Thou, O Christ, didst take upon thy shoulders our human nature, which had gone astray, and did ascend and offer it to God the Father, always now and ever, and to ages of ages. Amen." So it emphasizes this idea of the flock and this imagery of taking it on his shoulders, which immediately evokes the image of Christ taking the lost sheep on his shoulders, which emphasizes the bishop's responsibility to his flock. And originally it was made out of wool, and that further emphasized, like white wool, that further emphasized the connection to sheep and flocks and things like that, and pastoral connotations. So connected to this idea of the lamb gone astray and needing to be rescued by this pastoral figure.
Does it drape down the back too, or just the front?
Yeah, it drapes down the back, so it looks the same in the back and the front. So that
The middle one does.
Yeah.
so this piece will drape and hang loose
Okay.
in the back, right? And the Y, it just forms another Y in the back, and in this one, in the fake one. Yeah, and then of course the small one is just like a stole, so it doesn't go anywhere. What you see is what you get.
It's the same pattern as it used to be 2 pieces of fabric for the, what's it called, the
Epitrachelion?
the one that's dripping like oil, right?
Epitrachelion, yeah.
Yeah, the epitrachelion, the round the neck one. The neck thing, you said, right?
Yeah.
The neck thing, it used to be 2, but then they simplified it, so it's the same,
Yeah.
it's the same pattern,
Yeah, and I'll talk more about it in a second. I'll take this opportunity to just give one comment about terminology of vestments. So sometimes you'll see, like for instance, the sticharion, and then sometimes you'll see stichar, right? In Russia, they just abbreviated it, right? Or epitrachelion versus epitrachil, right? Once again, you can see, or the omophorion or the omophor, right? Now, these are not 2 different terms. It's the same term, obviously. It's just a different form of the same term. It's the kind of.
My impression from the bit of Russian I've learned is that, obviously partly because of the history, but Latin to us is like Greek to them. So like anything like ceremonial or religious important, they'll have, please be quiet, they'll
All
like
right.
resuffix it to make it work with like Russian grammar and phonology, but it's basically like a
Yeah.
Greek word.
Yeah.
Which is why it's right that we Texanize it with a,
Epigonation.
yeah.
Yeah, and it's not actually just the Russians that did it. You see abbreviations in other Eastern contexts too. So, for instance, I can't remember if it's the Syriacs or the Coptic Christians. They have their priestly stole. So they have their equivalent of the omophorion is called the batrachil. But the weird thing about that is that's derived from epitrachelion, which is the priestly stole. So they call their omophorion what we call our priestly stole. And probably that's because this term was introduced and it was just associated with some kind of stole, and they forgot the original form of it, and they associated with the bishop's one rather than the priest's one, right? Stuff like that. Okay. So as I said, there was a category of ancient. So what is the origin of this garment, right? Just talked about the spiritual meaning, the idea of going after the lost sheep, putting it on our shoulders, the pastoral responsibility of the bishop to do so. The historical origin is kind of the same as the orarian and all these different little pieces of napkins and things. It's these sudaria, these ceremonial napkins or cloths or scarves. A scarf of office is sometimes what it's called. Now, this does have a very interesting origin, though, because when you look at images of Christ as the great high priest and King of Kings, he wears his omophorion in a way that depictions of the Byzantine emperor would wear a different garment called the loros. Unfortunately, I didn't include an image of a loros, but it's pretty close to what an omophorion looks like. It's like a scarf that's wrapped around the body, and you see here that Christ has the end of his omophorion wrapped around him and over his arm, and that's how the loros would have been worn by emperors and empresses, wrapped around the body and then over the arm.
It looks a bit like the girdling that's done underneath
The girdling?
the girdle, yeah. It looks a bit like a girdle, but for
Well, it's not wrapped around the arm.
Well, I know, but in terms of it passing through the waist,
Yeah, although that's just wrapped around the waist and tied. Yeah. Yeah, in the sense that it's wrapped around the waist. Yeah, sure. But okay, so why am I talking about that? So the loros. So as I said, the sakos was originally this imperial tunic that was adopted by bishops, as they themselves found themselves as part of the aristocracy of the Byzantine world, the Roman world, right? Kind of like how in the Anglican Church, like bishops sit in like their parliament or something, and they're like lord bishops, you know. So like the ancient Orthodox and Catholic worlds have the same thing basically, right? That's why we call them master, despota, or sayidna, or vladika, lord. We're calling them lord, right? So another garment that had its origin on the highest levels of aristocratic garments was this loros, right? The emperors and empresses wore it. And it was originally a kind of toga. So the ancient form of it was basically, imagine a toga and how it wraps around the body, right? And then like time progresses and people didn't really wear togas anymore, but it was preserved in this high ceremonial function. But a real toga became very hard to like wield and wrap around, and so they folded it over and then wore it around themselves, right? And then that became too hard too, and so they folded it over again and wrapped it around themselves. And then they did it again until it was a narrower band of fabric, and they wrapped it around their body in the same way that a toga was wrapped around the body, right? If you think about how a toga, they have it on the shoulder, like the end of the fabric, right? And so that's why they wrap around the scarf around their body over the shoulder, right? And so visually, it has this connection to these imperial scarves called the loros, which was originally an entire toga wrapped around the body.
Real quick,
It was called the trabea triumphalis or something like that, yeah.
okay, so, sorry, the Greek's been bothering me. All right, so I think I figured out these.
Okay,
words, so
but-
that's- sorry, what?
Is this super important to the vestment?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, oh, it's okay, yeah. Okay, so now, and specifically that style of toga, along with being something worn by the aristocracy, was also worn by specifically philosophers. And actually, Tertullian mentions that he regarded this form of this late antique version of the toga as being his ideal garment for philosophers and Christians, because he associated with a kind of noble antique simplicity. So is that why the bishops started wearing this omophorion? We don't really know, but maybe there's a connection there. Now, is there a connection to the West? So I've been trying to make connections to the West every time, and we can say, yes, of course there's a connection to the West. So here we have two Eastern saints, I believe St. Gregory and St. Basil here, wearing the omophoria. You know, and we see 3 stripes on St. Basil, 2 stripes on St. Gregory. It has no meaning whatsoever. And then we see some popes over here wearing the Omophorion as well, although in the West it was called the Pallium.
Oh,
It was called the.
Leo has, I've seen him in a little
Yes, yes, indeed. So,
similar.
yeah, when you look at,
Oh, yeah, nothing, yeah.
yeah, so basically in the West it went through a transformation. It originally had the same look as the Eastern Omophorion, and then it became this Y-shaped thing, similar to actually Patriarch Sviatoslav's
Yeah.
fake one, the clip-on Omophorion.
This is like a time,
Yeah.
this is amazing, look at this
Yeah,
diagram.
and then they just kind of made it into a circular thing for simplicity, and now it looks like this. Pope Benedict briefly wore an ancient form of it that resembled an Omophorion, but then he switched back to the current form.
In the West, what rank of clergy wear?
Bishops,
Okay.
bishops, right? But so the thing is, so as I said, originally these episcopal regalia were only granted to certain bishops, right? So originally the patriarch and probably the pope too. They received it from like the Byzantine court kind of thing. They're, oh, this is nice. I'll wear this kind of thing, right? In the East, it rapidly spread to other bishops too. Whereas in the West, the Pope kind of had more of a handle on things, and so he was the barrier between these Eastern treasures and the other bishops of the West. And so all this fancy stuff kind of accumulated in the episcopal office and his regalia, right? And so there came to be a practice where the Pope would grant the right to wear the pallium to basically his top guys, bishops, right? So he has a ceremony, I don't know if it's every year or every so many years in Rome, where he grants the pallium to like certain bishops as an award, right? So it's an episcopal award. So not all bishops wear a pallium, unlike in the East where they all wear the Omophorion.
That's kind of interesting because that mirrors the different political developments and maybe reflects the culture that produced the different political developments.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, more centralized in the West, in the Pope, yeah.
More egalitarian amongst the bishops in the East.
At least in some places, but yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's, we can see what it looks like for us today. We can see some historical examples in iconography, East and West. And then we see what it looks like today in the West. So you don't really see this. He wore it briefly, and then he stopped wearing it because, like in videos of his masses and stuff wearing it, it's constantly falling off because it's like not designed. It's a reconstruction, right? That he revived. So it's like constantly falling off of his body, and like he has attendants constantly fixing it back on. And so I think he just got fed up with it and was like, no, we're just going back to what there's a reason it developed for us, you know. Yeah, so that's kind of interesting. Okay, so this is actually the last thing we're going to talk about. What time is it? It's 7:41 now. So do I talk about it or do I wait until next time? Let me ask. Okay, I'll keep talking about it. And Rebecca can, if she has to leave, she can watch the recording or something. Yeah. Yeah. So maybe the next thing that everybody thinks about when they think of the bishop is, of course, his mitre, right? Either an Eastern bishop or a Western bishop. You know, everybody wears a fancy hat. You know, if you're a fan of Seinfeld, the episode where George converts to Latvian Orthodoxy.
I need to go watch this.
Yeah,
Movie night.
Right. Like that.
was it for a woman?
I think so. Yeah. So he goes to talk to the priest, and the priest is like, I'm confused. What interests you in Latvian Orthodoxy? And he was like, it's a very noble religion, you know, and I like the hats. The hats give a very pious feeling, and that's what I'm looking for in a religion. Yeah, everybody likes a fancy hat. And so, and of course, in the West, their mitres are pointy, and we associate bishops with their mitres. In the East, we also associate our bishops with their mitres that look more bulbous and crown-like, we can say. Yeah. So, did you get this bit about the pallium though?
Me?
Yeah.
No.
Oh, yeah. So in the West, they have the pallium, which is the same as our Omophorion, right? So,
Oh, yeah, I totally see that.
yeah. So in the West, only some bishops wear it because it's granted by the Pope.
Okay.
Because like in the West, the Pope kind of was the one that controlled all the, what everybody wore and stuff. And so he got the fancy stuff, and he delegated it to the people he wanted to award it to, you know. And this is how it developed into what it is today in the West, right? But it's the same garment theoretically. Yeah, and so the
Just a long rectangle folded in different ways.
yeah, so
It's either a T shape or a rectangle over and over and over and
Yeah.
over and over again.
yeah, yeah. So as we talk about the mitre, and since we've seen so many vestments, especially the bishop's vestments, since we've seen that so many of these seem to be derived from Byzantine court and Roman court clothing, we should address a common misconception, which is that the Patriarch of Constantinople and Eastern bishops simply started dressing like the emperor when the emperor went away, right? This is something you hear, especially in a lot of popular explanations of why our bishops look the way they do. They'll say, oh, after Constantinople fell, there was no more emperor, and so the bishops started dressing like him. Now, it kind of has a ring of plausibility to it, but it also kind of makes no sense, because why would he do that? And also, they began wearing this before Constantinople fell. And like, if you're dressing exactly like the emperor and the emperor's still around, that's the kind of thing that would get you into a lot of trouble in ancient kingdoms, right? Like in ancient China, only the emperor could wear yellow. And like, if you tried to wear yellow, you were like put to death, you know? So you don't wear the clothing of the emperor. In late Byzantine ecclesiastical insignia, when we think about late Byzantine ecclesiastical insignia, we have to keep in mind that it did not replicate exactly what the emperor wore, but rather pontifical vestments combined various elements of court clothing from different ranks, making something completely new. Because it was hazardous, as I mentioned, to try to look like the emperor, especially when he's around. He might get a little mad. It was also hazardous to look exactly like a member of the court, because it would admit inferiority to the emperor. Like if you look exactly like the prime minister, then that's how the emperor is going to treat you, as the same rank as my prime minister, which is inferior to him as the emperor.
The bishops wanted
So the bishop wanted to be something completely different that the emperor couldn't compare himself to, right? So he took some little things from the imperial regalia. He took some things from the various regalia of the Byzantine dukes and princes, and especially he took things from the garments of the office of the Sevastocrator. And the Sevastocrator was kind of like a prime minister kind of guy, or like basically the right-hand man of the emperor. And a lot of people will say the mitre was the imperial crown that the emperor adopted, but once again, he's not going to do that. Rather, it has a bunch of different sources that kind of converged, and the most important one of these is probably the official headdress of the Sevastocrator, which was called the what was it called? I have it. Oh, the Skaranikon. The Skaranikon. And the Skaranikon was a bulbous hat that had jewels and fancy stuff, and it had in the middle of it an image of the emperor, which indicated from whom the Sevastocrator derived his authority. He represented the emperor, right? But then what the patriarch did was on his Skaranikon, he put an image of Christ, saying that his authority came from Christ. And so it was interesting because he adopted the hat of an inferior to the emperor. However, the actual image on it indicated that he was superior to the emperor. But it was a sleight of hand kind of thing, right? Because if you just put on the imperial crown, the emperor would get upset. So he took on an inferior one, but put on a superior image, right? And he did other things too. Like we saw that blue sakos, the blue hierarchical garment. Blue was associated with the Sevastocrator too, and also the use of blue ink, and also a certain color of shoes. I can't remember exactly. And he adopted all of that stuff. But once again, he was not admitting inferiority because he put Christ on it, and Christ on his garments too, right? So it was a sleight of hand, a kind of very wise as serpents kind of thing.
Is this connected to the icons on wedding crowns then?
I think, yeah. Well, I'll show you more pictures of crowns, and you can just see there's a pattern of putting icons on crowns. Yeah.
Well, Because it's clearly fetching it and rendering it for like a second.
Yeah, yeah. So what did I want to show exactly? Oh yeah, I just wanted to point out this is what the Skoronicon looked like, right? So if you zoomed in, that would be like an image of the emperor there. Yeah. And then what are these guys? That was just okay. I guess that wasn't so important. It was just another image of a early mitre. Yeah, with once again the icon of Christ in the middle, and then over here.
I think that one loaded.
So
The wrong tag.
Well, that one's more, the beads is more like the one that Jesus was wearing in that
Mhm.
icon.
I'll ask again, is that turquoise in both of those?
what?
That one and then on the right?
What turquoise? I don't know. I don't know what.
Looks like it.
Yeah, I
Oh,
just
okay,
find that
yeah.
surprising.
Yeah.
It doesn't strike me as something that the Byzantine Empire would have.
They had a lot of stuff. Yeah. So the Byzantine emperor, the Patriarch of Constantinople began wearing his hat no later than the mid 14th century. According to some sources, it was white with the image of the deisis with Christ and the Mother of God and St. John the Baptist flanking him. It was also called a calyptra. And like I said, it was a kind of skoronikon, a kind of Sevastokrator's hat with the image that was bulbous. And I already explained why he would do that. It asserted his authority. I think there was another image, but so okay, I'll point out here in this crown, this was the Holy Crown of Hungary, which was a gift from the Byzantine Empire to the monarch of, I guess, whatever king, I guess was Hungary from the Middle Ages, I don't really know, but whatever polity existed at that time. It's considered a relic of the Hungarian royal family, but it is originally a Byzantine crown granted by the emperor, and you can see that the central image is the emperor, right? So I just want to point that out, right?
I thought that was just a goofy looking size.
No, well, specifically it wouldn't be, right?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, Jesus might be somewhere on here, but that's the emperor. And yes, emperors had halos because he was the image of the glory of God and to the minds of most Byzantines, right? I don't know which slide I'm on now, so sorry. I'm just trying to sort through my. Okay, so there's evidence that so once again, this is only the Patriarch of Constantinople, not everybody else. Ignore this image. This has nothing to do with Patriarch of Constantinople. But other bishops pretty quickly began wearing hats too, because like I said, everybody wants the stuff. Everybody wants the regalia. Give me the drip,
That's what I was thinking. I was thinking of drip.
Yeah, yeah. And specifically, it was Rome and Alexandria that seemed to have long traditions of wearing hats. The Pope wore a hat, and the Pope of Alexandria wore a hat, who's also called the Pope, by the way.
I still call it.
Yeah, he's called the Pope. And the early form of papal headgear derives from a Byzantine hat called the kamalaukum. And here is depicted a kind of fancier kamalaukum with jewels and stuff and like sort of decked out like a crown. But the normal kamalaukum, it was just like a cap, a round or pointed skull cap. And so there were fancier ones and less fancier ones. The fancier ones had jewels and embroidery. The less fancier ones were just a cloth hat.
Is the older, pointier one meant to look more like depictions of Aaron as the high priest?
No, it was a secular garment. It exists. Yeah, it wasn't. They probably wore it even before Christian times.
I figured that was the case. It just
Yeah.
reminded me more of depictions of Aaron I've seen.
Well, interesting you say that because we'll see something related to that in a second here. So it's interesting that you bring that up. But it's not necessarily an earlier and later form, like probably somewhere around and somewhere kind of pointier. It's just kind of a tailoring choice, probably. But then, like I said, yeah, the fancier ones had jewels on them. And a key feature of it that will be retained in mitres is this band here called the circulus and this band here called the titulus, right? And we see in its development how it would affect the shape of the kamalaukum, right? So as the titulus became tighter than the surrounding fabric. It drew it in the middle and caused these sort of horns to develop on either side, and it eventually became the points of the miter. And then they just turned it around, and it became, yeah. But even when they turned it around, they were like, "Hey, what happened to that band that looked kind of cool?" So they just put it in the front, although originally it was what pressed down the middle, you know. And then it eventually became the miter that we know in the West, et cetera, et cetera. But also, so this is how it became the Western Episcopal miter. But also, the Pope had a different hat that had the same origin. It was basically a really fancy version of it, right? It got decked out with jewels like this, and it became stiffer and bigger and pointier. In some forms, it was bulbous and round. But we'll see here, actually. Actually not here. So this is actually a depiction of Saint Cyril of Alexandria wearing his headgear. The current Orthodox Pope of Greek Orthodox Pope of Alexandria wearing his mitre, which looks a lot like a papal tiara, actually, and a depiction of another ancient Alexandrian mitre, which looks similar to a papal tiara as well. The 3 layers, you know. So my point is that some sees had ancient traditions of headgear: Rome, Alexandria, and Constantinople.
Is that like the jewel drip that we saw? Is that related to like, you know, the 2 strips of fabric? You know, if you've got a map.
Yeah, I think they are related. Yeah. So we see in Byzantine crowns of both men and women these dangling jewels called pendilas, and that's all it is. It's decorative dangling jewels, you know. And I think it did somehow become connected to the lappets of the mitre, at least visually speaking. You know, people just like dangling things. You know, it looks.
Well, I guess especially if they turned it or something, they're like, well, you know, let's get them closer.
Yeah, it's just it's all about that. Like, you know, a lot of garments is about how things look in movement, and how glorious it looks in movement. You know, and also there was this idea that, especially on a king's crown, that the dangling jewels shield his vision from evil, because he has to rule with justice. You even see that in like Asian crowns with like dangling beads and jewels in the front. You know, same idea there. This is an image of an early. Well, this is actually a modern one, but it's the same form as the style of mitre used in the old Rite of Russia, which probably mirrors what early mitres look like too. It's less bulbous, more narrow, and more sort of cloth based than like hard jewel based. You know what I mean? It's more like embroidered cloth rather than like hard jewels on metal kind of thing. Yeah, so we have side by side a mitre that we know, the Byzantine mitre that we know, and then the papal tiara, which is no longer worn by the popes, but it's still part of their like symbolism and stuff. And they all sort of derive from a sort of ambiguous network of hats of the ancient of late antiquity. It's not clear how everything's connected. So on the one hand, there's the camelaucum that I just talked about, the Pope's skull cap that developed into the mitre, and then there's the scaranicon of the Byzantine court with the icon, and probably they all just sort of kind of converged in their own ways, because you do see a kind of resemblance, especially between the papal tiara and the Byzantine mitre. But when you squint, you can kind of see it with the regular mitre too. And even when you see other hats, so hats are the most complicated thing actually, because the word camelaucum became the Greek kamilafkion, which is the hat that the priest wears, the black stovepipe hat. So it's the same word as camelaucum, but it became the priest's hat. And no bishop calls their hat the camelaucum anymore. So once again, it's probably one of these things where things were passed down to the lower clergy. Like as the bishop began wearing like a jeweled one, he gave the simple one to the priest, and it became the camelauckion of that we know today. But we see also like the Russian skufia, and also the Greek skufia too. It sort of resembles the ancient form of the camelaucum, right? Mm-hmm. So it's probably like when the bishops had their fancy ones, they gave the simple ones to the priest, and it was originally some kind of form like this, and it became the beretta of the West, and in the East it became the skufia, and then some were extra long, and so they just stiffened it and like shaped it, and it became the kamalafkian. They're like, oh, what should we call it? Oh, there's that old word, kamalaukum. Let's just call it that, kind of thing. And then to point to the connection between these hats, you see that some Orthodox bishops have adapted a very primitive form of the mitre that looks like the simple hat, right? So we see how they both come from the kamalaukum. But also, there's the influence of the skaranikon with the icons, right? So it's very ambiguous how these hats are related. And the Pope has a hat called the camero, which also kind of looks like a kamalaukum. And actually, the word camero is a corruption of kamalaukum. So the Pope still has a hat called the kamalaukum that's different from his tiara, although etymologically it's the same as what the tiara used to be called, right? So hats, I think that reflects how fashions change from era to era, but then things are retained because of tradition, right? They just become a different thing. Like the simple one becomes something like his little Santa hat,
Yeah, I was going to ask.
Yeah.
Is that connected to any iconography of St. Nicholas?
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like Saint Nicholas is depicted like a bishop, right? And so a bishop wears a bishop's hat, and then the bishop's hat is like from what era, right? So if you depict it in like this kind of antiquarian way, he's depicted in like like a really ancient looking one that looks more like a cloth hat,
Yeah,
and
I'm
then
asking if that's an anachronism for St. Nicholas or.
well, all icons are anachronistic. Like when we depict any saint in an icon, he's wearing like Byzantine. Like if we,
That's why I'm asking. Yeah.
well, that's my answer to you.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's like iconography by its nature is
Right,
anachronistic.
I'm just
Like
trying to figure out how much of the modern Santa garb is like an anachronistic imputation. Like I'm trying to, because when was St. Nicholas like?
oh, he was like the era of the Council of Nicaea. So like
Okay,
Yeah.
so very okay, yeah. Oh yeah, because there was that myth about him.
yeah,
pushing
but like
it.
anytime you see an icon, like even of like Saint John Chrysostom, that was probably painted in like the 15th century. You know what I mean?
Okay.
And so they're already so there's already a convention of depicting like saints in like really old looking garments. Like even like modern hieromartyrs and stuff, they're often depicted in like Byzantine garb, even though they lived in the 20th century. So I'm hesitant to use anachronism because like I would say that there's a convention of antiquarian aesthetics, in iconography. I'm actually for the Santa thing, I'm actually not sure exactly the connection, right? Because like the iconography of Santa Claus as we know today has gone through so many iterations, and like what we know today is like more influenced by like Coca-Cola and like cartoons and stuff, right? But I've seen some depictions of St. Nicholas, like both Eastern and Western, that look more bishop-like. He'll wear like a red mitre and like a red sort of cope kind of thing. And then like in a lot of Orthodox churches, maybe Byzantine Catholic churches too, they'll just have someone dressed like a bishop.
Yeah, we do that.
Yeah.
We have a costume, and there's a bishop's mitre that's part of it.
Yeah. So we can see side by side like these early sort of forms of headgear and see, yeah, there seems to be some kind of connection there, even if it's not totally clear. Because a lot of times in the literature, they'll say like the Western mitre has nothing to do with the Eastern mitre. They're completely different things. But when you look at like the early forms, it's clear that they're connected, even though they're very different today. One is pointy, one is round, and just for kicks, I have some images of Pope John the
So
23rd, I believe, yeah, celebrating the Saint Pope Paul the 23rd, celebrating the Byzantine liturgy.
Cool.
Yeah, so so he has a Eastern bishop with him. So he's actually dressed in a interesting way. Instead of so he's wearing as close as possible to the Byzantine vestment. So he's wearing a kind of dalmatic, sakos-like thing, and he has his pallium on instead of the Greek omophorion, and he has his tiara rather than a Greek mitre. And then he also has another garment. I'm not sure if it's totally clear, but on his shoulders he has this stripe thing, and that's called the fanon. And the fanon used to be worn by other bishops too, but then the Pope sort of consolidated his right to wear it. And it's a kind of superhumeral, meaning that it's a garment that is decorative to the shoulders. And that's interesting to me because, when we look at ancient icons, you know, I kind of talked about this last time, but like a lot of ancient icons depict, like the fancy part of the vestment is often, well, here we kind of see it in these examples, but it's often the neck opening, the yoke of the garment, right? You see it in the red one there, but in the icon, so yeah, these guys too. But it reflects how in icons, well, I mean these examples, but you guys, you can remember. Whatever. So I'm curious. This is just my own personal speculation that maybe there used to be a vestment that was like a superhumeral, like a special like decorative piece, like a jeweled piece that went on the shoulders. Because when you look at icons of even priest saints, their Phalonian seems to have like a jewel, like we saw, right? But I'm wondering if the early form of it was like a piece that could come off, that was like could be worn, because that reflects imperial regalia too. Like like on the emperors on their loros, their omophorian looking thing, there was another part to that which was like a jeweled shoulder piece that connected to the loros, right? So I mean that interests nerds like me. Maybe to y'all it's just kind of
Well, that would be, I mean, like you could change out the color of your
Yeah.
vestments or something and then still have the same jeweled piece without
Yeah.
having it.
and the fact that it exists for the Pope, like he has.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not jeweled, but it's like theoretically probably you can imagine a fancier jeweled piece, like maybe in the Middle Ages or something, you know. So it's interesting, you know. There's obviously a connection. So you were talking about Aaron a second ago. So it's interesting because in depictions, even Orthodox depictions of like this is Samuel the prophet. This is some Old Testament. Oh no, this is the Saint Zacharias, I think, or whoever circumcised Jesus. But these Jewish priests, and regardless, are depicted with hats, but they look almost like early Western miters. Weirdly enough, right? This looks like that one middle form of the Kamalaukum that became the mitre. You know, you even have the titulus and the circulus. The titulus bringing down the fabric, bunching it on the sides, and then this just looks like a mitre, like a medieval mitre. So it's interesting. Why would Byzantine iconographers depict hats like this that look like Western mitres? You know, unless it was like maybe they recollected some connection between the two. You know, something like that. You know, or maybe they were copying Western icons. You know, we'll never know. But that's actually the end. So.